From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Some of our colleagues will join us as they can get off duty and lunch hour, things like that. On behalf of my colleagues, and in particular Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the African and Middle East Division, I'd like to welcome everyone to this very special lecture today. I'm Joan Weeks, head of the Near East section, which is the sponsor of today's program, along with the Roshan Institute for Persian Studies. We're very pleased to continue the Persian Book Lecture Series this year with the 2016 focus on literature and the performing arts. With this program, Persophilia, Persian Culture on the Global Scene. But before we start today's program and introduce the speaker, I'd like to give you a brief overview of our division and the resources in the hopes that you'll come back again and do your research here, use our collections, and enjoy some future programs. This is a custodial division which has 3 sections that build and serve the collections from 2 researchers from around the world. We cover over 75 countries and 24 languages. The Africa section includes all the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. The Hebraic section covers Hebraic and Judaica worldwide. And the Near East section covers all of the Arab countries, including North Africa, Turkey, Central Asia, Iran, Afghanistan, the Muslims in Western China, Russia, the Balkans, and the people of the Caucasus. So it's a very extensive area of coverage. After this program, we'd like to invite you to fill in the evaluation forms that you see on your seat. This helps us plan for future programs. And we'd also like to invite you to try out our new Four Corners blog. Our specialists have written very interesting special editions of items focused on a particular aspect of the collections. This is contained with posts from the Hispanic, Asian, the European, and our own African and Middle East division. We also have a Facebook page, and we'd like to invite you to like us on Facebook. We also promote our programs through that, so you can always keep in touch with what's coming up. And we will also be videotaping this program today. So 2 things about that. If you ask a question at the end, you're implicitly giving your permission to be taped or videotaped. And also, you'll be able to have this program about 6 weeks from now. We will be uploading it on our website, and the URL will be available to researchers worldwide. So that's another added advantage. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Hamid Dabashi, our Persian specialist, to give a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Joan, and thank you everyone for coming day after the election. I wanted to just in 2 seconds say that this is the finale for the Persian Book Lecture Series for this year, 2016. Our partner, Dr. Fatemeh Keshavarz, is here, and we've been doing this now from 2013 onwards. Our lectures again pick up next year in 2017, and it would not have been possible without the help and effort of the wonderful folks at University of Maryland, Samar, Susan, prior to that, Naz, and of course Dr. Keshavarz and Dr. Ahmad Kar Mustafa, and of course Matt himself. So without taking too much time, I just want to mention, stay tuned. In 2017, we will continue. And thank you so much for your support and coming. And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Keshavarz from University of Maryland, who will introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Hirajan. I'm not going to take a whole lot of time so that you can actually hear the speaker. Dr. Dabashi was here when we had our major exhibit that brought, 1,000 years of the Persian book that brought about 1 million visitors to the library, and he gave a beautiful concluding presentation. He's a very distinguished scholar of Persian studies on many, many different fronts. He was born in Iran and did his early stages of his education in Tehran before he moved to the United States, and he did a PhD both in history and in sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. Ever since then, he has been writing on numerous books and articles in areas starting with sociology of the Muslim majority cultures in the world to Islamic philosophy, and that really is something that makes Professor Dabashi's work unique in a way because it's deeply rooted both in the textual tradition but at the same time in the social realities of the world in which we live. The book before this one that he's going to talk about on Persian literary humanities is really a unique contribution to the works coming out of the humanistic and literary tradition of Persian within the Islamic context in which it came to be and to enrich the world. But in addition to all of that, he has worked on cinema. He has written beautiful works on the study of cinema. And I would like to draw attention before transregional matters became very fashionable. He always did his work transregionally by looking beyond the limited geographical area we call Iran. So without further ado, let me just call on Professor Hamid Dabashi. Please welcome him to speak about his latest book, Persophilia, which is available here, and I'm personally looking forward to reading it since I haven't had a chance yet. So Hamid-Jan, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming, especially on a, how shall I say, dramatic and traumatic day like this. I'm absolutely delighted to be here next to being at home with my family and reassuring my children. This is the place that I'd like to be, in the company of my dearest friends, before which I'd like to express my gratitude to the Library of Congress for generously, kindly, graciously, this is twice, hosting me here. And particularly Mr. Dinavari and my colleague, Dr. Fatemeh Keshavarz, for being so gracious and kind to my work. Writing, as I'm sure you know, is a very private and insular event when we work. We're always like a potter. I always use the metaphor of a pottery. You're in your pottery workshop. And then every once in a while you look at one pot and say, well, it's ready to go. So put it on your window for people to watch. Speaking of watching, as Dr. Keshavar said, I have lots of filmmaker friends. And these filmmaker friends read my books and make movies about them. So there is a short clip about this book that I think is the best introduction to what this book is about. I'd like to ask you please to take a few minutes to look at it, to watch it, and then I'll talk more.
Good enough? Sound?
Mozart's Magic Flute, Handel's Xerxes, Puccini's Turandot, Nietzsche's Das spoke Zarathustra, Goethe's Das Ausländische Divan, Hegel's Philosophy of History, Edward Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat Omar Khayyam, Matthew Arnold's Tragedy of Sohrab and Rostam, Montesquieu's Persian Letters, Gauguin and Cézanne's paintings. There is an endless list of the masters and masterpieces of European art, literature, music, poetry, and philosophy, in which we note an irresistible attraction to things Persian, an attraction that marks the multifarious Persophilia. Whence the origin and wherefore the destination of the European and thence global fascination with things Persian? In Persophilia, Persian Culture on the Global Scene, I explore the landscape of a spectacular circulation of ideas between East and West that effectively dismantles those two coded illusions and posits a global scene upon which Persian culture was staged. From the biblical stories of Esther and Mordecai to Xenophon's Cyropedia, from the philosophies of Hegel and Nietzsche to the music of Handel and Mozart, from the poetry of Matthew Arnold's Sohrab and Rustam and Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam to the classical texts ranging from Montesquieu's Persian Letters to Goethe's Besoßliche Divan. From the rise of the European Enlightenment and Romanticism to the height of American Transcendentalism, down to the groundbreaking arts of Gauguin and Matisse. I map out a spectacular geography of European social, intellectual, and artistic history in which Persia and Persian culture were definitive, and which in turn went back to Iran and its Persianate continental context to cause groundbreaking historical changes. The result is an epistemically provocative reading of world cultural and political history, seismic in its proportions, unnerving in its dismantling of normative historiography, and transformative in its theoretical implications for radically altering our reading of the post-colonial nation-states. In my Persophilia, I seek critically to alter our conception of the European and therefore global fascination with Persian, and by extension Oriental, culture by locating it on the transnational bourgeois public sphere and thus show it to be definitive to the social, intellectual, and artistic movements of the 18th and the 19th century, from the Enlightenment and Romanticism to the American and French revolutions. But all of that is only half of the story of Persophilia. For my concern with the European fascination with the Persian culture does not remain stationary and static on the European site and travels eastward to Iran and its continental environment to see in what particular ways the echoes and reflections of this Persophilia turn out to play transformative roles in the course of nation-states, the production of a transnational public sphere, and the formation of the post-colonial subject. Determined radically to recast our understanding of European and non-European social and cultural history, my Persophilia is performed in a dramatic key in comparative cultural criticism, effectively decentering Europe by bringing it into the fold of the larger regional and global history. With a steely and unwavering gaze, Persophilia harbors neither an animosity towards the West nor an ahistorical celebration of ideas and social formations in the East. Dismantling that false binary, I follow the circularity of capital, labor, and marketplace of ideas and social movements the occasion, and thus seek to reveal a vision of global history that will break new epistemic grounds for the next generation of scholarship to come.
Well, as you can tell, for the duration of writing this book, I was in the company of magnificent music, looking at beautiful paintings, and so forth. Now, let me summarize, in addition to what you just heard, what were some of my concerns that drew me to this study. As I'm sure you know, there is a groundbreaking study by my own dear friend, late colleague Edward Said, called Orientalism, published 1978. The basic argument of Edward Said, as you know, is the production of a kind of knowledge about the Orient that was concomitant with the European age of colonialism. Prior to Edward Said's study, in the 1950s, a French historian, Raymond, had written a book called The Oriental Renaissance, Raymond Schwab. And the point of Raymond Schwab in Oriental Renaissance was how, in addition to the other Renaissance that we know, there was a period of attraction to things Oriental, particularly Indian culture, that was influential in the formation of European culture of the period. My study of Persophilia is somewhere in between those two studies, but more specifically about things that Europeans call Persia, not Orient at large, but very specifically about Iran. And at some point in the book, I said the devil of Orientalism is in the detail of Persophilia. The fact that Europeans have been attentive to the Iranian history from the Hebrew Bible to classical antiquity is known. Cyrus the Great appears in the Hebrew Bible repeatedly. The Book of Esther is about a period in Jewish history that has to do with a Persian queen. And also the classical antiquity, Aeschylus's Persian, for example, Xenophon's Cyropedia, the book about Cyrus the Great, which we are in the presence of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had a copy of Xenophon's Cyropedia, and in fact he wrote marginalia on his own copy. Xenophon was contemporary of Plato, both of them students of Socrates, and in fact for a period of time Cyropedia competed with Plato's Republic as a mirror for princes. At any rate, these are more classical period. In the first chapter I do talk about these classical period, but my interest is more on the 17th and 18th century, when these attraction to these things, Persian, for example, in Montesquieu's Persian letters, I ask, why would Montesquieu be interested in something called Persian letters? It's a book of satire about these two fictive Iranians who come to France and keep writing letters back home. Just before he writes The Spirit of the Laws, this is the man who wrote the definitive book on the separation of powers in a democracy, which we hope will continue to have in our democracy. So I began to place works such as Montesquieu's or Persian letters, or Goethe's West-Östliche Divan, or even books like Nietzsche's Das Spok Zarathustra. I began asking, why would Nietzsche call one of his most critical books Das Spok Zarathustra? Why not Das Spok Christ or Moses or Muhammad or whoever? This did not quite fit with Edward Said's notion of Orientalism, namely production of knowledge in the service of colonial power. These books, in fact, were definitive to social and intellectual movements in Europe, and by extension, through the extension of Romanticism into American transcendentalism, they became definitive to the point that Emerson thought he was a reincarnation of Sadi. And so I always say, when they asked Martin Luther King who was he influenced by, he said by Gandhi. Gandhi said, I was influenced by Thoreau. And Thoreau said, I was influenced by Sadi. Those, apropos the question of boundaries and borders and east and west and north and south, such historical facts, in fact, transcend these fictive frontiers. Here, what became important to me is the formation of what the great German sociologist, philosopher Habermas calls the formation of the bourgeois public sphere. Because it is not, this is a period that Europe is emerging from its own post-French Revolution period, and public sphere, public conversation, public knowledge, public reason, the period of enlightenment, is when they begin to pay attention to other cultures, non-European cultures. This is a period that Goethe thought of world literature, or ideas of world history became important. So the idea of the world, or non-European cultures, becomes definitive in the formation of social and intellectual movements in Europe and United States. So as a result, I do a kind of an uncanny thing that locate specific references to things Persian. In painting, for example, in music, there are hundreds of operas from Handel's Xerxes, which you just heard a little bit of it right here, to many, many others, in which the period of the Achaemenid, the figure of Xerxes and Cyrus the Great, etc., become very definitive. My argument is, to cut to the chase, that the metaphor or the trope of Persia, predicated on biblical and classical antiquity, but extended into, for example, Matisse's fascination with Persian carpet and Persian painting, and how these paintings, from the design of Persian carpet to miniatures, the exhibitions of Persian miniatures in Paris that Matisse had seen, they begin to be present and instrumental and at some point even definitive to the formation of these social and intellectual and artistic movements within the European public sphere. But here, as I said here in the narrative, is only half of the story. My interest is not to say, oh, lo and behold, how lovely is that, ain't that cute, that the Iranians had an influence on Europe. The real part of my argument is when that public sphere becomes transnational, and by virtue of the global operation of the capital, the taste and preferences and choices and status symbols of things that are happening in European public sphere, they traveled. They traveled to the rest of the world. So I put it provocatively that wherever British colonialism goes, so goes Omar Khayyam. Because it is initially the translation of Fitzgerald's Fitzgerald's attention to Omar Khayyam that turns Omar Khayyam into a phenomenon in the English-speaking world, and then eventually comes to the United States, goes to the Arab world, and to the Indian subcontinent. And I underline the paradox that, for example, when you hear Kulthum, for example, singing Omar Khayyam, Rubaiyat, this is not directly from, I mean, Egypt and Iran are not that far, but it is in the aftermath of the location of Omar Khayyam on a global public sphere that now Egypt receive it. The same is if you go to Pakistan or Indian subcontinent and the attention of Allama Iqbal, Lahori, to Rumi and Hafiz. Iqbal discovers Rumi and Hafiz in Germany while he's doing his doctoral dissertation in Germany, and then he goes back to India/Pakistan, and suddenly Rumi becomes so definitive to his thinking that constitutes like Virgil in his version of Divine Comedy. Here, then, I have a more theoretical preoccupation, which is how does on Iranian context or the Persian world or the Islamic world or third world, whatever term we want, suddenly this reflection of one particular attention, European attention to things Iranian, has repercussions beyond the control of the original European attention. So I play with Habermas's notion of public sphere, and I call it parapublic sphere. There is a parapublic sphere that, for example, in, say, Nietzsche's attention to Hafiz becomes very definitive to Nietzsche's notion of Dionysian pleasure, then goes back to Iran and gives rise to the poetry of contemporary masters like Shamlu and Forough Farrokhzad and so forth. So it is, in a sense, a kind of intellectual historiography, as my colleague Dr. Keshava said, that does not remain constant within fictive frontiers of colonial and post-colonial boundaries in order to understand the social phenomenon. Pays much more attention to historical realities of how, for example, canonization of literature happens. I have a whole chapter on re-canonization of Persian literature in the aftermath of European attention, for example, to Ferdowsi. Yes, Ferdowsi was known, celebrated, and loved, and even in this very library, I'm told that there are manuscripts of Shahnameh extant. But the rediscovery of Ferdowsi and his epic, I propose, is something that happens in the aftermath of the European reception of Shahnameh, when Matthew Arnold begins to compose his poem, famous poem on Rustam and Sohrab, when Jules Moll prepares his critical edition of the Shahnameh, when Nöldeke writes his pioneering study of Shahnameh, or when E.G. Brown, for example, writes his 4-volume literary history of Persia. And who is next to E.G. Brown when he's writing his 4-volume on literary history of Persia is Muhammad Ghazvini, the doyen of Persian literati of the early 20th century. And he goes back to Iran. He and his generation are instrumental, that generation of the literati, are instrumental in defining and codifying and canonizing the history of Persian literature. So if you remain confined, this is my argument, if you remain confined within one particular political border to try to understand literary historiography, artistic historiography, cultural historiography, you will have a distorted conception of all of those things. Another example I give, and then I'll stop, hopefully we can have a conversation if you so wish, is This is not the first time. 16th century Persian literature has a far more hospitable environment in the Mughal India and goes to Mughal India. And if you want to study Persian literature, historiography, poetry, anything of the 16th century, you have to go to India. And in fact, literary history of Persian, particularly in Safavid period, is very, very weak. I mean, they are great in architecture and in art and in philosophy and theology and many other things. But the actual Persian literature, called literature, poetry in particular, if you want to study it, you have to go to India. So as a result, on the model of the world of Persian literary humanism, I offer not a post-colonial national frame of reference for our understanding of literature, art, music, so forth, but an imperial. That is, the three pre-modern, as they call them, Muslim empires, the Mughals, the Safavids/Qajars, and the Ottomans, ultimately yield to the incoming European imperial conquest. And the proverbial Persian poet that habitually in history exits a royal court, say Ferdowsi in the Samanid period, exits the Samanid court, there's another court, the Ghaznavids, enters the Ghaznavid courts. This is historically has happened many times. You exit one royal court, you go to another royal court. In the 16th century, when the Safavid sultans are not interested in poetry, they find a hospitable environment in India, so many of them go to India. But in the aftermath of the collapse of these three empires and the rise of European empires, the proverbial Persian poet exits the Qajar court, looks around, there is no other royal court to go to. Suddenly they discover that there are these Europeans in English, French, German, Dutch, are interested in Persian in their own bourgeois public sphere, not royal court. Thus, we have the emergence of Iranian or Arab or Turkish bourgeois public sphere. In fact, Arif Ghazvini, a very important poet of the constitutional period, says in so many words that before I'm quoting him, before I talked about the word Vatan, which means homeland, 9 out of 10 Iranians didn't have any clue what is Vatan. And he's right, because he invented it in his poetry. And homeland, I propose, is the functional equivalent of the bourgeois public sphere, because it is on this public sphere that the generation of, say, Mirza Saleh Shirazi, they bring the first printing machine on which they publish the first newspaper. The simplification of Persian prose takes place. If you read, for example, Abul Hasan Khani Ilchi, the first diplomat of Iran in England, he apologizes early in his travelogue. He says, you have to forgive me, this is a very simple prose, because the florid language of, say, the Qajar period and before that is not yielding to the necessity of talking to a public that is emerging on the space of the public sphere, and that is the most revolutionary phenomenon that the effect of which continued to happen until the Constitutional Revolution and many other revolutions, the Young Turks revolutions, the resistance to the British in India, etc. So, to make a long story short, I begin on the European public sphere and the attention to these kinds of Persian material. And not all of it is high culture. I, in fact, pay attention to when high heel, for example, when did people begin to wear high heels? It was actually Persian ambassadors to European courts that had high heels. And then European monarchs began to imitate them and have high heels. It was at some point that then this transformed into women wearing high heels rather than men, appealing to the aristocratic culture. So there are many of these sort of nitty-gritty aspects of the of this dialectic in which I'm interested, but not for themselves, but for the carrier of more important transformations of society, culture, history, and so forth. I hope some of what I said made sense. I hope you get to read the book, and thank you for your patience, and I will be happy, with pleasure, with pleasure, with pleasure.
So, folks, feel free to ask questions, and Dr. Dabashi will engage. And if you could repeat the question, because we would like to have it recorded. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hamid. I really look forward to reading your book, and I think a key point that you make is that the devil is in the details, so we have to really focus on every detail. One thought that I have when you address the question of canonization of some of these texts, their appeal to the European intellectuals and so on, and there's definitely some truth to that. I think it's you established that. But what does that do for the way these texts actually travel within their indigenous context, and as well as concepts such as Watan? I can see it that in that particular specific context, this is what happens. But does that really mean that the inhabitants of Iran did not have an idea about a homeland or wherever they belong to? So, in other words, what happens to that indigenous
Very good.
voice?
Yeah. Excellent question. The question is, yes, let's agree that there is a transnational public sphere on which these words such as Vatan, homeland, takes shape, or these texts are reconceptualized, re-canonized. But what about the indigenous history and genealogy and etymology of all of these words? Now, the way I address that is that I don't believe in one specific indigenous environment with capital I. There are multiple indigenous environments. And for historical references, I opt to operate within a specific imperial contexts. I operate within the Seljuqid period, and I look at Seljuqid period and say, okay, in this period, how does canonization happen? What are the texts that are important? Why is it that it takes from the, early in the 11th century that Ferdowsi finishes Shahnameh until we get into the 13th century when Nizami Aruzi writes Char Maqale, that we have the first account of who this Ferdowsi was. Now, this doesn't mean for 2 centuries people didn't know who Ferdowsi was. There are extant manuscripts of Shahnameh at the beginning of the Shahnameh. In fact, we have the rise of all of this folkloric aspect between the relationship between Ferdowsi and Sultan Mahmud, etc. So there are many localities, many indigenous vernaculars. I mean, I will not even call them vernacular because I don't want to give primacy to the European and then vernaculars to others. I just want to show multiple layers of history, in each one of which, because of proclivities of one empire as opposed to another, or also the other thing, which is the subject of the previous book, as you remember, the internal logic of the development of a literary tradition in and of itself before we reach the European. So your point is absolutely well taken, but I place it in a larger frame of reference. So this period of 18th and 19th century European context falls into a much larger context of not only the 1400 years of Islamic history of Iran, but even pre-Islamic period that gives us a much better perspective of how canonization actually takes place. Please.
I apologize if this will be apparent when I read your book, but do you see a sort of monolithic Persophilia, or do you see a sort of variety of Persophilia? I'm thinking specifically in the context of the age of imperialism. So what Said maybe argued Orientalism argue that we couldn't detach the production of knowledge from political interests and empire. But we have cases such as Germany, for example, that did not have colonies in the Persian Gulf, but were producing just as much knowledge, if not more, than Britain and France. And so it makes people look about the motivations behind those Persophiles Orientalists versus those.
Excellent. Again, the question is if I believe, as I indeed do, multiple Persophilias, not just one mode of Persophilia. Absolutely, I do. Again, as the example that you gave, that Edward Said's Orientalism, book Orientalism, is mostly on British and French. Doesn't say much about either German, except occasional references to Goldsteer, and also to Russian Orientalism, which is equally, if not even more important than European. And precisely the same way that the German Orientalism has a particular genealogy and vintage, which is different from Russian Orientalism, that especially in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution has a decidedly Marxist, historical materialist disposition to it. The same is with Persophilia, of course. But as I said, for my purpose, I concentrate on on those specific cases that the picking of a Persian element is instrumental in the formation of progressive social movements, such as Romanticism, such as Enlightenment, such as Transcendentalism, such as groundbreaking philosophical counter-essentialism a la Nietzsche, such as modernist painting, etc. I deliberately, in the introduction, I talk about that these are the two trends on which I stand. I don't negate them. I'm not offering it as a counter reading, but those are the two positions, Schwab and Said, that are the predicates of what I do. And what I do is to go counterintuitively, not when the knowledge about the Orient is produced in order to make it subjugate to anything, but in fact, it has entirely is tangential, because it is on the bourgeois public sphere. However, in the aftermath of the construction of Orientalism within the bourgeois public sphere, what happens, it becomes a status symbol. Whether it is in closing or in, as Anne-Marie Schimmel writes at some point, that after Goethe's Auswärtsliche Divan, suddenly there were scores of blue eyes and blonde hafizes that appeared in Germany. So this means that the bourgeois consciousness, bourgeois public sphere, bourgeois self-awareness is beginning to assert itself on public sphere in terms that it is borrowing from, and it's not just Iran, it is India, it is the Arab world, it is all over the place. So it is the particular composition of the bourgeois consciousness that I'm interested in this period. And then my argument following Habermas is that this bourgeois consciousness doesn't stand, and in fact more on Nancy Fraser's take on Habermas, that this public sphere becomes transnational, that I follow it back into other parts of the world, which then comes to the sort of re-canonization of text. And I mean, you can do that with Abul Allah al-Ma'arri, you can do it with many number of other figures that, yes, they were known and loved and celebrated and subject of biographical dictionaries and all of that. But there is a new gestation that now happens by virtue of transnational imperialism predicated on transnational bourgeois public sphere that I think needs documentation.
I was just going to ask, you talked a lot about Said's work, and clearly, I know your other work that I think very interesting in Simon. I'm just wondering how you see this project in relation to his original work. Do you see it as making narrative a little more complex in terms of the way in which the transmission of knowledge is embedded in the broader imperial power dynamic? I'm just wondering.
Exactly. I would only add to what you just, the question is, how do I place this particular work next to my other works that are very much in conversation, I would say, with Edward Said, rather than influence. I actually intellectually come from a different genealogy. Edward Said, as you know, was a literary critic and very much came from a tradition of Auerbach and Mimesis. I'm a sociologist of culture by training. So when I read Edward Said's Orientalism, after having read Karl Mannheim and Max Scheler and so forth, it was not such a huge sort of event for me. What was an event was what was implicit in Edward Said's work, namely Michel Foucault's conception of knowledge and power. That knowledge and power, which informs Said's Orientalism, has remained very constant in my work. So I offer it, as you rightly, the word that you use, complicating. That's a better word rather than disagreeing or taking it other places. I want to see this power dynamic in multiple settings. This is actually a Foucauldian. I want to see how the power works in multiple settings, not just in a knowledge that a colonial officer produces. I mean, there are many of them, and in fact, I talk about them in the context of the book. But here, I don't go through a Saidian Foucauldian, but through deliberately Habermas's notion of bourgeois public sphere, because that to me because if in Said becomes Orientalist knowledge production and revolutionary knowledge production. Here I'm after a more subtle and perhaps insidious mode of knowledge production that is evident on bourgeois public sphere, and Said didn't see it because his point was something else. His point was to document a different set of trajectory. To me, this bourgeois public sphere, on a model, and also remember, this is a very Marxist, can we say Marxist in Library of Congress?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Particularly today.
Edward Said was a literary historian, not, this is a decidedly a class formation, bourgeois public sphere kind of a thing.
Thank you very much for your very interesting comment. I have a few questions, but I'm a cultural historian of modern Iran. So I start with Arfa Azmi and the notion of Vatan. As far as I recall from reading somebody like Abrahamian very recently for my class, the notion of Vatan has been redefined earlier on, even before somebody like Arfa Azmi. What Arfa Azmi does is he uses the notion and he introduces to his new medium, which is revolutionary tasnim. So that's how he basically propagates the idea through this new medium. So that's one of the comments. My second thought and question is, how do you see this notion of Persophilia coming back to Iran through Europeans and Americans writing about Iran in 20th century? Because looking at documents of the American embassy, for instance, in Iran, it's very hard to, sometimes it's really hard to basically distinguish the idea of Orient from Persian.
Very good.
They're very much intertwined.
Very good, yeah.
So they go really back and forth.
Okay, let me repeat, right? The first question has to do with the word Vatan, the way that Arfa Ghazvini, the prominent constitutional period poet, uses it, and its earlier gestation that have indeed existed. First of all, the word Vatan does not appear in Shahnameh at all. But it doesn't mean the concept is not there. There are concepts of Iran, there are concepts of Keshvar, there are concepts of many similar concepts, but not the word Vatan. And my point is, what is important about Arif is the coincidence of the word Vatan and the way that he uses it, and you're absolutely right, in the revolutionary disposition of Tasnif, which predates Arif Ghazvini, but he makes it popular, simplification of music and etc. What distinguishes it is the rise of the public sphere, namely an educated public, quote unquote, because it's a small public. But a century before, exactly, Arif Ghazvini uses this word. We have Mirza Saleh Shirazi bringing a printing machine with himself from London. He had a shawl, paisley shawl, that secondhand, that he sold it and bought a secondhand printing machine and brought it to Iran, with which he published the first newspaper. There was no word for newspaper, so he just called it kagaz akhbar, just, word for. And third, a century of simplification of Persian prose through translations and travelogues and so forth. This 100 years prepares eventually the formation of what Habermas calls a bourgeois public sphere on which now, when Aref uses the word Vatan, or when he uses the word Vatan in a tasnif, that he sings it publicly and people hear it, as khun jawanan Vatan lale damide, etc., it resonates with a public that prior to this 100 years, active formation of the public sphere did not exist. You have different kinds of social formations, but not a bourgeois public sphere on this model of encounter with Europeans. The second question about the medium of transmission, this is a very crucial point. How did this manifestations of Persophilia in Europe traveled to Iran? Here, my emphasis are more on merchants, diplomats, travelers, okay? That people like Mirza Abu Talib, for example, Safarnama, goes from India. And because he goes in India, plus the fact that just before him, his friend, his buddy that he knew him, Mirza Abdul Latif Shushtari, goes from Iran to India. In fact, we have a geographical space of Indo-Persian, which is far more accurate geographical territory rather than India and Iran at the time. So these, and then an example of young scholars at the time, like Muhammad Ghazvini, who is actually instrumental in the writing of the 4 volumes of E.G. Browne. And then many of these if you look at Ilchi's travelogue, if you look at many others, you see how this particular attention to the Iranian culture, literature, sometimes sarcastically, sometimes approvingly, sometimes they're just stunned why Europeans are paying attention to this, begins to be translated back into Iranian context or Islamic context at large. You're right that there is sometimes, if you look at the American embassy, etc., is a very new gestation, okay? Well, and we have to make a distinction between European Orientalism and American area studies / Orientalism. Is a whole different genealogy of it, which I address in a different book. In that context, what is important, the distinction between Persia and, say, India or the Arab world, is that the idea of Persia was known to the European from classical antiquity. And when Hegel is writing his philosophy of history, you remember, if you look at the teleology of Hegel's philosophy of history, he considers Egypt and India, he dismisses. He cites India and Egypt, but he dismisses what the Geist is not present yet. Geist becomes Geist for Hegel in Persia, and from Persia goes to the Roman Empire and goes to Germany, just to the neighborhood of Berlin, where he lived. So that, as I emphasize in the book, that familiarity with the thing called Persia, from the Book of Esther to Aeschylus's Persian, is a very important factor in how, in 18th and 19th century, Persia starts to be reconceptualized.
Okay, folks, we're almost at 1. We have a wonderful series of books, as Fatima Jan explained. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having
coming
me.
and
Thank
for
you.
joining us.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.